1 Samuel chapter 3 verses 3 to 10, and 19. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. Samuel was sleeping in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. The Lord called to Samuel, who answered, Here I am. Samuel ran to Eli and said, Here I am. You called me. I did not call you, Eli said. Go back to sleep. So he went back to sleep. Again the Lord called Samuel, who rose and went to Eli. Here I am, he said. You called me. But Eli answered, I did not call you, my son. Go back to sleep. At that time Samuel was not familiar with the Lord, because the Lord had not revealed anything to him as yet. The Lord called Samuel again for the third time. Getting up and going to Eli, he said, Here I am. You called me. Then Eli understood that the Lord was calling the youth. So he said to Samuel, Go to sleep, and if you are called, reply, Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. When Samuel went to sleep in his place, the Lord came and revealed his presence, calling out as before, Samuel, Samuel. Samuel answered, Speak, for your servant is listening. Here we have a story unfolding just like a stage play would do. The scene is set. The entire verse 3 tells us, the lamp of God was not yet extinguished, and Samuel was sleeping in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. The lamp of God was positioned outside the temple veil of the Holy of Holies. Many of the traditions of Jewish biblical life were retained in the Christian churches that followed. The lamp outside the Holy of Holies is one such tradition. It dates all the way back to Exodus chapter 27 verses 20 and 21, when God instructed the Israelites to place an oil-burning lamp outside the meeting tent or tabernacle. The symbolic meaning was that God was present just beyond the temple veil. Catholics retain this tradition. As you enter the church you will see a red flickering lamp just outside the tabernacle, again a symbol of God's presence. Now that the scene is set, it is time for the interaction of the actors. First, God is speaking to Samuel, but Samuel is confused by the message, mistakenly thinking that Eli was calling him. Second, we have Samuel, a youth of 12 years, and the focus of these conversations. Third, Eli, a wise man, in his old age, and the teacher or rabbi, and priest to Samuel. Samuel hears a voice calling out to him. It appears that only he and Eli are the only ones in the temple. He then assumes that it is Eli calling to him. Have you ever been awakened in the middle of the night thinking about a certain relative? That might have been God getting you ready for the next morning phone call, that the relative passed away, and you ask the time of their passing, and it is the same time you were awakened. Maybe you get the feeling you shouldn't take the interstate home this evening, you ignore the feeling, and you end up stopped in traffic, while waiting for the accident to clear the lane you are in. Just like Samuel, you won't go in search of Eli, you will begin to listen intently for the Lord's word that is being addressed to you. Maybe there wasn't an accident on the interstate, but you were the first person on the scene of an accident, and you know CPR because you resuscitate a non-breathing victim. Like Samuel, God has a plan for each one of us to be a thread in His tapestry of life. God allows everyone to join in His eternal plan without regard to age, sex or national origin. Eli was a priest, he was older, and in some ways wiser than Samuel, but this reading tells us of God's calling of Samuel. Eli threw himself into God's work but neglected his family. As a result, his sons would not be allowed to follow in their father's footsteps as the high priest. Eli, like so many other parents, tried to help their children out of trouble by paying fines or lying to cover up the sins of their children. A wise parent recognizes there is a time to release your child to the consequences of their sins. Eli went against God's direction and thus enabled his sons to continue their bad behaviors. It was time for a leadership change, and Samuel would be the instrument of that change. When narcotic detectives raided an apartment in a depressed neighborhood in New York City, the dark halls and dingy rooms were crowded with twisted, ill-fed, and ill-clothed derelicts. Out of this human scrap heap, the police arrested 6 men for carrying hypodermic needles and heroin. The renters of the apartments were charged with harboring drug addicts. At police headquarters, the meek-looking and mild-mannered man claimed that he had chosen to live among these people to provide them with food, shelter, and clothing. His door was open to all. He did not realize he was breaking the law by extending compassion to the drug users. The investigation revealed that the operator of this strange hostel was neither a vagrant nor a drug user. The dedicated man turned out to be John Sargent Cram, a millionaire, who had been educated at Princeton and Oxford. To avoid the rigmarole of organized charities, he had moved into the undesirable neighborhood and had gone to work helping the less fortunate. After his trial and acquittal, Cram was admonished not to take in drug addicts. Later he said to a reporter, "I do not know if my work does any good, but I don't think it does any harm. I'm quite happy, you know. I am anything but a pessimistic person. Call me eccentric. Call it my reason for being. I have no other." John Cram was answering God's call to service by helping the less fortunate. It is a sad commentary on our society that the courts basically told him he couldn't help all who came to him. In the court's opinion, addicts were undeserving of a compassionate hand. Samuel, just like John, was willing to reach out to others even if it hurt his social image and brought him real hardship. Samuel was the first of the prophets to speak of Israel's failure to live up to its covenant with God. As you might imagine, his comments were not well received. We should ignore the world's views, copy John Cram's example and follow Samuel's sentiments. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. Leave judging behind and extend a hand to others by doing the Lord's work.